Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
President Trump has announced that he's sending more troops to Afghanistan to fight the resurgent Taliban. It represents a reversal for the president who, whilst campaigning, had called for a quick withdrawal from a conflict which he'd called a total disaster. Washington is expected to send an additional 4,000 troops to the country. They'll join around 8,000 who have already been deployed there. But together, that's still far fewer than in 2011 when 100,000 US troops were in Afghanistan. Our North America editor John Sopel reports.
Donald Trump loves being a crowd pleaser, and throughout the campaign he delighted audiences with the promise to pull US forces out of Afghanistan. A gigantic waste of money and American blood, he said. So this speech was going to take a bit of navigating, because above the sound of the band playing Hail to the Chief was the screeching noise of a U-turn.
My original instinct was to pull out, and historically, I like following my instincts. But all my life, I've heard that decisions are much different when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office.
But what this flip-flop means in practical terms is hard to assess. The president wouldn't say how many additional troops he'd send, nor commit to how long they'd be there. The mission would be judged by results, not timelines. He called the policy strategic realism, and it was summed up thus.
We are not nation building again. We are killing terrorists.
Some of his harshest words were aimed at the Pakistani government, whom he accused of harbouring terrorists while taking billions of dollars in US aid. And though Kabul may be a long way from Charlottesville, recent events in Virginia were clearly in his mind when he said this.
Loyalty to our nation demands loyalty to one another. Love for America requires love for all of its people. When we open our hearts to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice, no place for bigotry, and no tolerance for hate.
More than 2,000 US troops have already lost their lives in Afghanistan, and the president would have liked nothing more than to announce their withdrawal. But the strategic importance of not letting Afghanistan to fail as a state again means that Donald Trump has had to sign his name to a policy that means there is now an open-ended commitment to the US remaining. Though Donald Trump has tried to dress this speech up as marking a significant shift in policy, the most striking thing about it is the sense of continuity with the Obama White House. And one other thing, now that this major policy announcement has come, this is Donald Trump's war in Afghanistan, not Barack Obama's, not the generals. He now has ownership of something he never wanted to buy. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, our correspondent, Secunda Kamani, is in the Afghan capital, Kabul, and President Trump says he's sending more troops. What's been the response there?
Well, the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has welcomed the announcement. He said that it shows that America would stand with Afghanistan until the end. Security in Afghanistan has been deteriorating. The government here only controls about 60% of the country. And there had been fears that if President Trump had ordered a complete withdrawal of American forces, then that would have been another boost for the Taliban. Mr. Trump's comments on Pakistan and his tough stance on Pakistan is another thing that's gone down well here. Afghan security services have long claimed that Pakistan is supporting the Taliban and have asked for more to be done to crack down on these so-called safe havens for militants. Those comments by President Trump, though, have been met with anger in Pakistan, where the authorities have consistently denied any role in supporting militant groups. The Taliban, for their part, have issued a statement vowing to continue the fighting.
Secunda Kamani, thank you.
Now, in a remarkable U-turn, President Trump says he will continue to commit US troops in Afghanistan. During the election campaign, he had pledged a complete withdrawal, but now says a hasty exit could create a vacuum for extremists like Islamic State. Mr. Trump called on other countries to help switch from nation building to killing terrorists. Well, tonight he's heading to Arizona in a bid to shift the focus back into immigration, as Geraint Vincent reports.
What is the world's greatest military power trying to do in Afghanistan? Over the years, the answer to that question has sometimes been confused. This Commander-in-Chief was trying to be clear.
We are not nation building again. We are killing terrorists. From now on, victory will have a clear definition: attacking our enemies, obliterating ISIS, crushing Al-Qaeda, preventing the Taliban from taking over Afghanistan, and stopping mass terror attacks against America before they emerge.
Afghanistan has been America's longest war, a fight which began after 9/11 when the Taliban gave shelter to Osama bin Laden, and continued as America tried to bring democracy to the country, to foster a new Afghan government. 2,500 American servicemen and women gave their lives in the attempt. One of the biggest critics of that $500 billion operation, one Mr. Donald Trump.
Money should be spent in our country. We should rebuild our country. And we should also, by the way, reduce our $16 trillion in debt. Let's get with it. Get out of Afghanistan.
America's military commanders always said that bringing stability to Afghanistan would take a long time and require sustained commitment, helping Afghan security forces to defeat the extremists on their own. The president appears to have heeded the general's advice.
My original instinct was to pull out. And historically, I like following my instincts. But all my life, I've heard that decisions are much different when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office.
So more American soldiers will now be going to Afghanistan for an unspecified period of time. It may be a U-turn, but it's also that rare thing in the Trump White House, a long-term strategy. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
Let's go to Robert Moore now. Now, Robert, the president is now heading to Phoenix in Arizona, where you are tonight. What did last night's speech actually accomplish, do you think?
Well, Mary, what played out last night after months of bitter feuds and rifts inside the White House, I think, is nothing less than a triumph for the generals who surround President Trump, for his national security advisor, for his chief of staff, for his defense secretary. Essentially, Trump is embracing, at least for the moment, their worldview that America cannot walk away from its international obligations and that a security vacuum in Afghanistan would be a grave risk. But obviously this is a spectacular U-turn from his campaign promises, which were so isolationist in tone. And that's one reason that he's coming here to Phoenix, to try and rally his core supporters, to try and mobilize his base over issues like immigration again. What we don't know is which Trump will turn up. Will it be the incendiary nationalist, or will it be the more pragmatic president we saw last night, who may be, for the very first time, listening to his more mainstream advisors?
Robert Moore in Phoenix, Arizona. Thank you.
In the last few minutes, the top US commander for the Middle East says the first new US forces will arrive in Afghanistan within days or weeks. This after an abrupt volte-face from President Trump, who reversed his previous call to pull American troops out. Instead, Mr. Trump declared, "We will fight to win." It's what his national security advisors wanted. But after 16 long years of conflict, will his strategy be any more effective? Here's our international editor, Lindsay Hilson.
This is now.
America will continue its support for the Afghan government and the Afghan military as they confront the Taliban in the field.
That was then.
Let's get with it. Get out of Afghanistan. We've wasted billions and billions of dollars, and more importantly, thousands and thousands of lives.
So what changed? Surely not the solemnity of office. But a cabinet full of military men is unlikely to recommend cut and run as a policy. More outlandish ideas, like replacing US soldiers with mercenaries. The suggestion of the president's sacked advisor Steve Bannon have been abandoned in favour of, well, pretty much the same policy as his predecessor, President Obama. Train the Afghan army, send a few more soldiers, scold Pakistan for harbouring the Taliban, make the best of a bad job. Since 2014, when most US soldiers pulled out of Afghanistan, the Taliban has been gaining ground. They're now believed to control fully 34 districts and are contesting another 167, wielding control over more than 8 million Afghans, almost a third of the population. The Islamic State likes to advertise its presence in Afghanistan. It's less pervasive than the Taliban, but the Americans are worried. In April, they dropped what they call the mother of all bombs on an IS contingent in Nangarhar province, killing about 90 militants. This is America's longest war ever, and it's not over yet. The Afghan president told elders that President Trump had promised no time limits nor conditions on US support. But he knows that at least with the Taliban, there's no military solution.
I have a clear message for the militants. You cannot win through war. Come and accept our hand, offering peace.
Afghan soldiers cannot win against the Taliban, who are embedded in the population. Nor could the Americans when they had 100,000 troops in theatre, more than 10 times the current level. But the language of compromise and diplomacy doesn't come naturally to Donald J. Trump.
Our troops will fight to win. We will fight to win.
The trouble is that in Afghanistan, fighting to win is not a strategy, but a form of magical thinking.
Well, joining me now from Camberley in Surrey is General Sir Simon Mail, a former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff who was responsible for Britain's operational policy in Afghanistan between 2009 and 2012. General, we're familiar with President Trump's U-turns. Is this, in your view, a sensible one?
I think it's a very sensible one, Jackie. I think the stakes are very high. We saw in Iraq the consequences of America stepping back too quickly. Equally, we saw in Europe and Korea the consequences of America staying the course. This is a generational issue. Although, as your reporter said, we had 100,000 American troops trying to technically do the job, the mission has changed. The Afghans are stepping up very bravely in many cases to do this, but they do require, for a while to come, a leveling of American and NATO technical expertise and competence, and it will then give them the competence. We hope there are other aspects of this, both international, regional, economic, political, but it will give them the confidence to stay in the fight.
But as we heard Lindsay say there, President Trump coming out and saying we fight to win, that's not a strategy, is it?
That is a very difficult issue to say. What does winning mean? But part of it, of course, to turn the Taliban narrative on their heads is not losing. And the longer that the Taliban and maybe other interferers like Russia or Iran see that America is prepared to stay the course, that the consequences of an Afghan collapse are understood by both America and the Europeans, the more perhaps that we can get sensible people round a table. We should not underestimate many of the advances that have been made in Afghanistan, but they are definitely at threat if the Americans go. I think that's inevitable.
You're talking about getting sensible people round the table, a sort of diplomacy as well. When President Trump comes out and says we're not nation building here, we're killing terrorists, I mean, is that helpful? And furthermore, is there any evidence that he'll be more successful at that than previous American administrations?
Well, I think the big thing is, as we've seen the effect in Iraq, given the collapse of the Iraqis in 2014 and the way they've stood up again in 2017 to retake Mosul and soon Tal Afar, is extraordinary how you can turn round the local the local security forces if they have a confidence that you are sending out a confident message that you are alongside them. And undoubtedly the anti-terrorist side of the operation conducted by the special forces keeps the Taliban on the back foot and hopefully completely suppresses ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then, of course, you are left with the Afghan government. But the Afghan security forces will have the confidence to take the fight if they feel NATO and the Americans are standing by them, albeit in a train and assist mode.
General, thank you very much for joining us this evening. General Sir Simon Mail, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fatima.
Well, President Trump will be speaking to a rally of supporters in Phoenix, Arizona tonight, and protesters are heading there too, with police on high alert. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris is in Phoenix. Kylie, what's going on?
Well, yes, Fatima, concrete barriers are already up around the convention centre. Schools and businesses are closing early. We've been told that police are at maximum staffing levels tonight. The mayor of Phoenix, in fact, asked Donald Trump not to come right now, to delay his visit here on account of the tensions over Charlottesville. But Donald Trump was in no mood to listen. He's already left D.C. He left shortly after giving that speech on Afghanistan. I've got a little bit more detail on that. I've just been listening to the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who's been fleshing out some of the detail of these additional 4,000 or so troops who will be going to Afghanistan. Again, he's making the argument that they are going to change the conditions on the ground by empowering their field commanders as they have in other places. There is a lot of heavy lifting to be done by the White House in order to make this argument, to win this argument. I think there are a lot of supporters of Donald Trump who are shocked this morning that he has not gone through with his promise of withdrawing US troops from Afghanistan. Indeed, if you look at the right-wing Breitbart News website today, there is a scathing report on his address last night. Perhaps that's evidence that Steve Bannon is making good on his promise of waging war on the moderates in the White House. Even though he's no longer in the White House, he's going to do it using Breitbart as his instrument. Certainly, though, there won't be only supporters at the rally tonight. There will be protesters as well, as you mentioned. They're gathering under themes of Jews against hate. White supremacists should not be pardoned. So they are there to hear Donald Trump again reaffirm his commitment to the wall, to fighting illegal immigration. And Donald Trump is there to hear their support firsthand.
Kylie, thanks very much. And more now on tonight's news about President Trump's new Afghan strategy. In the past few minutes, the US Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has repeated his call for a political settlement in Afghanistan.
This entire effort is intended to put pressure on the Taliban, to have the Taliban understand you will not win a battlefield victory. We may not win one, but neither will you. And so at some point, we have to come to the negotiating table and find a way to bring this to an end.
We will fight to win. That is now President Trump's battle cry for Afghanistan, a far cry from his pre-election determination that there should be an American withdrawal from the country. Now he's given the Pentagon authority to ramp up troop numbers and greater autonomy to attack the Taliban. Also in his sights in his Fort Myers speech was Pakistan, with the president calling for Islamabad to stop providing safe havens for terrorists. Mr. Trump said Pakistan had much to gain from partnering with the international effort in Afghanistan and much to lose from harbouring criminals and terrorists. Talking tough on Pakistan is not new, but taking meaningful action to prevent terrorism there has proven difficult. We'll assess what levers Trump has and how he might make his ire felt.
With General Kelly, he will be...
Donald Trump has appointed more generals to his cabinet than any president since World War II. Perhaps it's unsurprising then that after months of speculation and infighting, he seems to have bowed to the military stance on Afghanistan. Last night, in what appeared to be a dramatic reversal of his isolationist campaign rhetoric, Trump committed the US to a deeper involvement in its longest ever war.
We must ensure they have every weapon to apply swift, decisive, and overwhelming force. Our troops will fight to win. We will fight to win.
Currently, there are 8,400 American troops in the country, of a 13,000 strong international force. Trump refused to discuss numbers, but it is expected that the US will send a further 4,000. Despite the big talk, this is a tiny proportion of the 100,000 US troops in the country at the height of Obama's so-called surge in 2009. US Defense Secretary James Mattis has described the Taliban itself as surging, and this map from the Institute for the Study of War shows the extent of their fight back, with the government now in control of less than 60% of the country.
Steadfast in protecting.
Perhaps most striking today were the president's strong words for Pakistan. The US government has long accused Islamabad of failing to do enough to stabilize its neighbor.
Pakistan has much to gain from partnering with our effort in Afghanistan. It has much to lose by continuing to harbor criminals and terrorists. Thank you.
He did not make a specific threat, but it is thought that the US is considering expanding drone strikes within Pakistan, withholding aid, or even downgrading Pakistan's status as a major non-NATO ally.
I'm not sure that the pressure that Trump has put on Pakistan is going to result in Pakistan backing off its behavior. It could well double down on it. But he did add a new element, which is a rather explicit threat to engage India more heavily in Afghanistan. That'll certainly get Islamabad's attention.
Unofficial figures collected by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism suggest that there have been 428 US drone strikes in Pakistan since 2004. At their peak in 2010, there were 128 strikes, although that number has now fallen to just 4 so far in 2017. Pakistan, which views these strikes as illegal, would certainly not wish to see them escalate to such a level once again. We'll discuss what this means for the Trump presidency in a moment, but first I'm joined by Carlotta Gall, who for 12 years reported from Afghanistan and Pakistan for the New York Times. Her book, The Wrong Enemy, America in Afghanistan, argues that America was fighting the wrong enemy in the wrong country and should have instead focused their efforts towards Pakistan. Also with us is Associate Professor Christine Fair from Georgetown University, who served as a political officer for the UN to Afghanistan. Good evening to you both. First of all, Carlotta Gall, is this the right message and the right threats to Pakistan?
Undoubtedly. I think that for the first time we've heard some really strong talk. He's talking, they must change immediately. I think that's the strongest I've seen from any American president. We have to see what he follows through with. But I think Trump has for a long time talked like this. And so I think it's very interesting that he brings it out so strongly today.
What do you think should be the first lever on Pakistan? Should it be aid? Should it be withdrawal of student visas to come to study in America? What kind of thing would hurt Pakistan the most?
Well, the first thing they've already done is conditionality of the huge amount of money they give to Pakistan every year. They get about $1 billion a year. So you can condition that on performance, and they've already started that. Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, held up 50 million not long ago.
So,
but then there's plenty of things, drone strikes in Baluchistan, like the strike on Mullah Mansour last year, and then smart sanctions on some of the generals.
Well, I wonder what Christine Fair makes of that. I mean, Christine Fair, essentially, President Trump is building on President Obama's attitudes to Pakistan. But do you agree with Carlotta that actually it's actually likely to have more traction this time?
Oh, so Carlotta Gall and I are in just complete agreement. I was so excited to see her on this segment. I think she and I have been, we've been some of the few consistent voices saying that the real enemy is Pakistan, not Afghanistan. And I would actually even go further. The biggest program, and Carlotta intimated about it, which is the Coalition Support Fund. This is where Pakistan gets $1 billion a year, up to $1 billion, to do what a sovereign country is supposed to do, which is keep its country safe. I actually think that we should get rid of that program altogether. Paying Pakistan to do what sovereign countries are supposed to do actually does violence to that commitment in the first instance. I think that we should be completely re-examining our foreign military assistance. We should provide them no access to strategic platforms like F-16s that allow it to continue its aggression towards India. We should be willing to provide platforms that will aid it in conducting counterinsurgency operations, but providing Pakistan with F-16s under the guise of counterinsurgency operations is simply preposterous. And you actually cut Carlotta off when she was making a really important point that she and I have made repeatedly, and that is that we really need to think about smart sanctions. Not only visa denials, but specifically going after not only generals, but also civilians, intelligence operatives, with whom or for whom we have reliable information that they are supporting terrorist organizations. Like Carlotta and I are in complete agreement that the way forward isn't just denying aid. Pakistan views aid as entitlement, but we also need to develop the intestinal fortitude to develop sanctions. And this is going to very quickly run us into the very real concern that every policymaker in Washington raises when we talk about sanctions, and that's Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, which they basically use to blackmail us.
Yeah, well, just coming back to you, Carlotta, has Trump done enough? Has he indicated enough that actually he'd be prepared to lose this special non-NATO ally relationship that he has got with Pakistan? Should he have gone even further, Carlotta?
Well, he made the point that this special relationship may be there, but they're killing our soldiers in Afghanistan, as well as a lot of Afghans. So I think he drew a line, which I think a lot of us have been amazed that America hasn't done for all these 16 years. So what is there to lose? What, a nuclear strike? He's standing up to that. I think he's going to call their bluff.
But tell me, on the basis that he's leaving it to his generals to decide where and when, but is really the signal that you're going to send fewer than 5,000 more troops into Afghanistan going to really scare the Taliban back from the areas in which they've actually been taking recently?
No. No, that's not the point. The 5,000 are just going to be doing training and assisting. They're going to be holding the line. You know, the Taliban are attacking provincial capitals every month, and the Americans need to go and help the Afghans who are sent in to hold the line. So that's what that's doing, and it's a train and assist program. The extra 4,000.
Would it be unacceptable?
So that's not the point.
Very briefly, Christine Fair, would it be acceptable to the American people, given all that's been said, to commit more troops? Nothing like the surge, certainly, that Obama committed, but more troops to Afghanistan to fight. Is that out the question, Christine?
I don't think it is out of the question. And actually, to Trump's credit, he actually laid out why it is that the Americans need to continue caring about Afghanistan. I think he could have actually been stronger on that point. But if there's continued leadership in explaining that Afghanistan, but more precisely Pakistan, is actually the epicenter of some of the most pressing American national security concerns, I think Americans will go along with it. And I think that there's going to be bipartisan support. This may be one of the issues where we see bipartisanship, particularly the idea of bringing in India as a more forceful partner. This will certainly have bipartisanship in a time when we're desperately looking for bipartisan issues.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, back in Washington, some were wondering today what President Trump's foreign policy U-turn might say about the shape of his presidency. Last week, Mr. Trump's former aide, Steve Bannon, having been fired from the White House, told the readers of his right-wing Breitbart News that the Trump presidency he had campaigned for was over. Today's website was suitably critical of the Afghanistan announcement. While someone else with strong views on the subject is Eric Prince, the founder and former boss of the Blackwater mercenary group. Until recently, Mr. Prince had hoped the president might agree to a plan to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and leave securing peace there to the private sector. He says he was invited to the president's Camp David summit to drop the plans, but following the change in personnel at the White House, the invitation was withdrawn. Mr. Prince joins me now from Washington. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Tell me, Eric Prince, you have a history of running mercenary operations in the Middle East. What was the plan that you were putting forward to the White House?
Let me first clarify, Blackwater was not a mercenary organization. That was an organization that employed Americans serving America abroad. Look, I wrote an op-ed back in June that got the president's attention because it laid out a different strategy to how to end this war in Afghanistan. I talked about the need for a viceroy, and yes, that's a controversial term, but it wasn't to rule Afghanistan. That's really to be one leader that would coordinate U.S. policy. We have Department of Defense, Department of State, CIA in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. We've gone through 17 different commanders in 16 years. There's been no unity of command, and it's been very chaotic. And that's why the Pakistanis have been able to get away with double dealing really for this long, and why we've spent close to $1 trillion just in Afghanistan alone. And this year, the United States Defense Department will consume more than the entire UK defense budget just in Afghanistan. And as Secretary Mattis said, we're not winning.
So tell me, you can see that viceroy is a rather loaded term, certainly in terms of former British Empire, but the idea of a single viceroy to run this, was this going to be yourself?
No, absolutely not. No, I came up with that concept really to just have a unity of command. That should be a senior U.S. government official, someone that has defense, intelligence, and business experience to coordinate this effort, this largely this expensive mess. Sure. We've been going around and around for 16 years, the longest war in U.S. history by far, and to figure out a way to tie this off. But the Pentagon is talking about.
Sorry, can I just ask you about this? But surely President Trump, you might say that President Trump, having listened to all the generals around him, has shown a certain maturity today in actually sort of doffing his cap to their views, or do you think that's just a retrograde step? Do you think that's a mistake?
Well, you know, the president campaigned hard against this notion, and he resisted this notion for the first 7 months of his presidency, and it was finally the Pentagon kept coming back to him with really the only option of more troops and more money and more of the same thing we've been doing for the last 16 years, which hasn't worked. I don't think that policy will last for very long because even the rules of engagement. Look, the Taliban has had 3 open-air victory parades just in the last 3 months. That doesn't require any more troops from the Pentagon to strike those targets. That requires coordination and speed and innovation from the Pentagon to get after them. We have a Pentagon that has become so bureaucratized it can't operate at the speed inside the decision loop of the Taliban.
So wait a minute, so
are
you saying that people employed, out with the Pentagon, out with the U.S. military, people such as the people that you're involved with, would actually be able to use different rules of engagement and different methods, perhaps methods that are antithetical to the code?
No, let me clarify. This needs to be a true Afghanization of the issue. The Afghans continually resist against a foreign occupation force, which they've had for 16 years. They've had foreign forces that they're bothered by. My concept is to employ long-term contractors that would attach to each battalion, live with, train with, patrol with, and when necessary, fight side by side with a few foreign professionals to provide a structural support for each battalion. Combine that with some air support and some governance support, and you have a very different, higher-performing Afghan army. Remember, in the days after 9/11, you had 100 CIA officers, a couple of hundred special forces backed by air power, and they devastated the Taliban. They are not 10 feet tall. Right. They can be defeated.
Now, you caught not only the president's attention, but very much Steve Bannon's attention. And, of course, you are now close to Steve Bannon. And he has said over the weekend that the Trump presidency that he fought for is over. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, the president has a lot of different voices in his ears. I believe the president finally caved on this issue with going back to the same plan for the Pentagon, really just because of the fiasco that happened in Charlottesville. He felt very beat up politically, and he went with it. I don't think it's a decision he will stay with that long. He's got to find a way to do this because at the midterm elections and at the next election, the people that voted for him, those are the people who are sending their sons and daughters that are still dying.
So what you're saying is you don't think he'll stick with this plan for very long. So do you think there's a hope for your plan still?
Look, what I'm laying out is basic soldiering 101. In that op-ed, I even talked, I mentioned it's how the East India Company operated with the presidency armies. Again, not trying to develop a colonial force. This is an Afghanization of the problem. Professional soldiers attached to the Afghan army, by even the UN definition that makes them not mercenaries, providing that structural support long-term under Afghan rules of engagement and accountable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It is a much cheaper, much smaller footprint way and proven effective over the centuries way to build an indigenous force to stand on its own against any of the 20-some terrorist organizations resident in Afghanistan.
Eric Prince, thank you for joining us.
I've been getting